For 3 straight years, Ethan Carter had been the reason a technology and industrial manufacturing empire worth tens of billions of dollars ran without ever falling apart. Nobody applauded him for it. Nobody wrote his name in the quarterly reports. But when factories stayed open, when shipments arrived on time, when a crisis vanished before executives even heard about it, it was because a quiet man in a plain gray suit had already fixed it hours earlier. Then, in a single meeting that lasted only 10 minutes, he was replaced by Ryan Ashford, the chairman's son. There was no argument. There was no plea for mercy. Ethan simply signed his resignation, shook no one's hand, and walked out into the rain. 3 weeks later, the production lines began shutting down one by one. Major clients started canceling contracts in a single week, and CEO Victoria Sinclair uncovered a truth that made her blood run cold. The man they had so casually discarded had been the invisible foundation the entire empire stood on. New York City wore its autumn like a bruise that week. Gray skies pressing low over the glass towers, a fine drizzle coating the sidewalks in a permanent sheen. Inside the headquarters of Ashford Industrial Technologies, the 40th floor buzzed with its usual controlled chaos. Phones ringing, printers churning, junior analysts hurrying past each other with folders pressed to their chests. In the middle of it all, without ever raising his voice, Ethan Carter moved through the hallways like a man who had memorized every crack in the foundation of the building itself. He was 38 years old, quiet by nature, and utterly unremarkable to anyone who did not know what he actually did. Most employees assumed he was simply another director with a corner office and a title too long to remember. Few understood that he was the reason nothing around them ever truly broke. His office sat 2 floors below the executive suite, tucked between a supply closet and the finance department, a location that seemed to reflect exactly how the company valued him: useful but unseen, essential but easily overlooked. Junior employees who wandered down looking for a signature or an answer to some tangled logistical puzzle always left with more than they had come for: a solution, a shortcut, sometimes even a quiet word of encouragement they did not know they needed. He kept a small notebook on his desk, filled with handwritten diagrams of supply routes and contingency plans, pages worn soft at the edges from years of constant reference. Nobody in the building had ever asked to see that notebook, and nobody realized that inside, it lived the true architecture of the entire company. He had been divorced for several years, and his son lived overseas with his mother, a fact he mentioned to almost no one, and that colored the quiet solitude he carried through every long night at the office. There was no bitterness in him about it, only a steady, private ache he had learned to fold into his work. People who passed his desk after 7 in the evening often found him still there, sleeves rolled up, 3 monitors glowing in the dark, solving a supply chain failure that would have cost the company millions had it reached the executive floor. He never complained. He never demanded credit when a warehouse in Ohio flooded and threatened to delay a shipment to a client in Germany. It was Ethan who rerouted the entire logistics chain overnight, and by morning, no one upstairs even knew there had been a problem at all. Victoria Sinclair, the chief executive officer, was 36 years old. Sharp-minded and fiercely disciplined, the kind of leader who trusted spreadsheets over sentiment and results over reputation. She respected data above almost everything else, which was precisely why she never noticed the man behind the numbers. She saw quarterly growth, stable operations, and satisfied clients. And she assumed, as most executives do, that success was simply the natural output of a well-oiled corporation. She did not see the thousands of small emergencies that Ethan absorbed every single month before they ever became visible. She trusted her department heads to report accurately, and none of them ever mentioned that half of their solutions had actually originated from a quiet operations director 2 floors below. That autumn, Ryan Ashford returned from business school with a freshly printed MBA and an appetite for authority that far outpaced his experience. He was 31 years old, confident in the way that only people who have never truly failed can be, and utterly certain that leadership was simply a matter of charisma and instinct. He had spent 2 years studying theoretical frameworks in air-conditioned lecture halls, And he genuinely believed that running a company was no more complicated than presenting a strong argument in a boardroom. His father, Chairman Richard Ashford, had spent decades building the empire and now wanted nothing more than to see his son inherit real power before he stepped away from the company entirely. Richard had grown the business from a single small factory into a sprawling industrial giant, and every decision he made in his later years was quietly shaped by the question of legacy, of whether the empire he had built would outlast him in the hands of his own bloodline. He had watched Ryan grow up surrounded by wealth and comfort, and though he loved his son deeply, he had never fully reckoned with how differently privilege shapes a person compared to the hunger that had once driven him to build something from nothing. Ryan, for his part, had spent his years at business school absorbing case studies about disruption and innovation. Convinced that the operational caution of men like Ethan was simply an outdated relic of a slower, less ambitious era, he often told his father, over quiet dinners in the family's Upper East Side apartment, that the company was coasting on old thinking, and that it needed someone willing to break things in order to build them better. The chairman called a meeting on a wet Tuesday morning, gathering the senior leadership in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the fog-choked skyline. Ryan spoke first, his voice smooth and rehearsed, insisting that the operations division needed fresh energy, modern systems, and a leader who understood the future rather than clinging to outdated processes. He looked directly at Ethan as he said it, though he never mentioned his name, and the implication hung in the air like smoke. The chairman nodded along, already convinced before the meeting had even started, and Victoria hesitated only briefly before offering her approval, telling herself that new perspectives were rarely a bad thing for a company that had grown comfortable with routine. Ethan said nothing in his own defense. He listened to the decision the way a man listens to weather. He cannot change, calm, composed, and entirely without protest. When the meeting ended, he returned to his office, gathered nothing but a framed photograph of his son, and spent the rest of the afternoon transferring every file, every password, and every operational record exactly as company policy required. He did not delete a single line of code. He did not hide a single spreadsheet. He left behind a company that was, on paper, exactly as functional as it had been the day before. And by evening, he walked out through the revolving doors into a cold and steady rain, disappearing into the city without a single word of bitterness. A junior analyst named Marcus Webb, one of the few people who had worked closely enough with Ethan to understand even a fraction of what he actually did, stopped him near the elevator bank and asked, quietly, whether he intended to fight the decision. Ethan only shook his head and said that some battles were not worth winning, because winning them would mean staying somewhere he was no longer wanted. Marcus watched him step into the elevator, the doors closing over a face that betrayed no anger, no self-pity, only a kind of tired peace that came from a man who had already made his decision long before the meeting had even ended. Outside, the rain fell steadily over Manhattan, and Ethan walked 6 full blocks before finally hailing a cab, needing the cold air to clear a mind that was, for the first time in years, entirely his own. Ryan took control of the operations division the very next morning, moving into Ethan's old office with the enthusiasm of a man rearranging furniture in a house he had never actually lived in. Within hours, he announced sweeping changes, declaring that outdated procedures would be replaced with what he called modern efficiency models borrowed from his business school textbooks. He dismissed 3 senior managers who had worked at the company for over a decade, calling their experience irrelevant in a rapidly evolving industry, and replaced them with friends from his university cohort who possessed impressive resumes but no understanding of the company's actual infrastructure. He deleted long-standing workflow systems without fully understanding what they had been designed to prevent, treating years of accumulated institutional knowledge as clutter rather than as the scaffolding holding the entire operation upright. One of the managers he dismissed, a woman named Diane Foster who had spent 11 years quietly managing supplier relationships across 3 continents, tried to explain to him before she left that the system he wanted to tear down had been built specifically to survive the exact kind of unpredictable disruption the industry regularly faced. Ryan waved her explanation away, telling her that sentimentality about old processes was exactly the kind of thinking that had kept the company from reaching its full potential. He replaced her with a former classmate named Tyler Grant, a young man with a polished resume and an impressive vocabulary, but no real experience managing a supply chain under actual pressure. Within days, Tyler was making decisions based entirely on theoretical frameworks from his textbooks, unaware that the very redundancies he was eliminating had been the reason the company had survived 3 separate supplier crises in years past without anyone outside operations ever noticing. "I'm going to modernize this company," Ryan told a room of stunned employees during his first all-hands meeting. His tone bright, with the confidence of someone who had never once had to clean up his own mess. He believed, quite sincerely, that the previous systems had simply been the product of an overly cautious mind, unwilling to take the kind of bold risks that separated great leaders from mediocre managers. Victoria watched from the back of the room, arms crossed, feeling the first faint stirrings of unease she could not yet fully name. Still, the first week's revenue numbers came in stable, even slightly improved due to residual momentum from processes Ethan had already set in motion weeks earlier, and Ryan mistook that stability for proof of his own brilliance. Meanwhile, in a modest office on the other side of the city, Ethan accepted a freelance consulting position with a small logistics startup struggling to organize its supply chain. The pay was a fraction of what he had earned before, and the office had none of the polish of his old building. But there was a quiet peace in the work that he had not felt in years. He never once mentioned his former employer by name, never spoke ill of the people who had replaced him, and never allowed bitterness to creep into his conversations with his new, grateful clients. In the evenings, he called his son overseas, listening to a small, distant voice describe a school project or a soccer match. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like a man with room to breathe. The startup he now worked for, a small logistics company run by a determined young founder named Rachel Nolan, had only a fraction of the resources his old employer commanded, but Rachel treated every one of his suggestions with genuine gratitude, something he had rarely experienced during his years at the larger corporation. She often told him that she could not understand how any company would let someone with his instincts simply walk out the door, and he would only smile and change the subject, unwilling to dwell on an ending he had already made peace with. He began sleeping better than he had in years, waking without the familiar knot of anxiety in his chest that had once accompanied every sunrise before a long day of quietly catching other people's mistakes. For the first time in a long while, his work felt like his own again, small in scale but entirely undiluted by other people's credit. The first cracks appeared exactly 3 days after Ryan's takeover. Quietly at first, the way a small leak begins long before anyone notices the water stain on the ceiling. A production line in the Midwest facility stalled for nearly 6 hours due to a scheduling conflict that the old system had always caught automatically before it became a problem. Ryan blamed a technical glitch, assured everyone it was a minor and temporary setback, and moved on without investigating the deeper cause. 5 days after that, one of the company's largest clients, a European manufacturing partner worth hundreds of millions of dollars in annual contracts, filed a formal complaint about delayed shipments and inconsistent communication from the operations team. By the 10th day, the company's enterprise resource planning system began generating errors that no one on Ryan's new team knew how to properly diagnose, since none of them had ever been trained on the customized architecture Ethan had built specifically for the company's unique supply chain. Warehouse deliveries slowed to a crawl. Shipping containers arrived at the wrong ports, some destined for Rotterdam ending up in Hamburg instead, creating a costly tangle of logistical confusion that took days to unravel. Operational costs quietly climbed as Ryan's team scrambled to patch problems with expensive short-term fixes rather than addressing the root causes buried deep within systems they did not understand. Tyler Grant, now responsible for the very supplier relationships Diane Foster had once managed so carefully, discovered too late that several backup vendors Ethan had quietly cultivated over the years had never been formally documented anywhere in the company's official records. Those relationships had existed as personal trust built over countless phone calls and favors exchanged during difficult seasons, an entire invisible safety net that simply vanished the moment the man who built it walked away. When a primary steel supplier suddenly raised prices without warning, there was no backup contact ready to step in. No negotiated contingency plan waiting to be activated, only a scramble of panicked emails that went unanswered for 2 critical days, while production quietly ground to a halt. Victoria called an emergency meeting. Her patience thinning as she watched numbers that had once been reliable begin to waver. Ryan sat across from her, still composed, still confident, insisting that these were merely small, isolated hiccups that came with any major organizational transition. "This is just a minor issue," he told her, tapping his pen against the polished table, as though the gesture alone could make the problem smaller than it actually was. What none of them fully grasped yet was that the entire operational backbone of the company had been quietly held together by hundreds of interlocking procedures that Ethan had designed over years, procedures so seamlessly integrated into daily function that they had become invisible, mistaken by everyone for simple good luck. Victoria left that meeting with a faint unease she could not yet articulate. A small voice in the back of her mind, whispering that something more fundamental than a temporary transition problem was beginning to unravel. She asked her assistant to pull together a summary of operational incidents from the past month, expecting a short, uneventful list, and instead received a document 3 pages long. She read through it twice that night at home, alone in her apartment, with a cold cup of tea beside her, and found herself returning again and again to a single, uncomfortable question. How had a division that once ran so smoothly become unrecognizable in less than 2 weeks? By the start of the 3rd week, the crisis that had been simmering beneath the surface finally erupted into full view, and there was no more pretending it was a temporary inconvenience. 2 entire manufacturing plants halted production simultaneously. One due to a raw material shortage that the old inventory system would have flagged weeks in advance, and the other due to a safety compliance issue that had gone unnoticed for days. Watching shipments arrive late and inconsistently began terminating contracts one after another, some citing broken trust, others simply moving to competitors who could guarantee reliability. Financial news outlets picked up the story within days, running headlines that questioned the sudden operational collapse of a company that had, until recently, been considered a model of industrial efficiency. Analysts speculated openly on business television programs about leadership instability, comparing the sudden downturn to other well-known corporate stumbles caused by inexperienced succession planning. One commentator, a sharp-tongued financial journalist named Patricia Hale, noted during a live segment that the company's failure pattern looked remarkably similar to what happens when an organization loses a key person nobody outside the building ever knew existed. Her comment, though brief, circulated widely among industry insiders and reached the desks of several board members before the day was over, adding yet another layer of scrutiny to a crisis that already felt impossible to contain. Employees inside the building began whispering among themselves in break rooms and stairwells, trading rumors about layoffs and closures that only deepened the growing sense of instability spreading through every department. The company's stock price began sliding sharply, wiping out months of steady gains in a matter of days, and board members who had once trusted Victoria's judgment now demanded answers she did not yet have. She traveled personally to the Midwest facility, walking the factory floor in low heels that were entirely wrong for concrete and grease, listening to line managers describe problems she had never even known existed. Again and again, in break rooms and hallways and hurried conversations near the loading docks, she heard the same quiet refrain from exhausted employees who had clearly been holding their tongues out of respect for the new leadership. Ethan used to handle this, they said, almost apologetically, as though admitting a secret they had been protecting. A floor supervisor named James Odom, a broad-shouldered man who had worked the line for nearly 20 years, finally spoke more candidly than the others once Victoria assured him his honesty would not cost him his job. He told her that Ethan used to walk the factory floor personally every single week, not to inspect or criticize, but simply to ask workers what small frustrations they were facing before those frustrations ever became expensive problems. He explained that half the fixes credited to department managers over the years had actually originated from those quiet floor conversations, ideas Ethan had gathered from the people closest to the work, and then quietly implemented without ever needing recognition. Victoria stood in the middle of the humming, half-idle factory, surrounded by silent machinery that should have been running, and felt the full weight of what her company had allowed itself to forget. For the first time since taking over as chief executive officer, Victoria felt something close to genuine fear settle into her chest, not because the numbers were bad, though they were, but because she was beginning to understand just how little she actually knew about how her own company functioned. She had spent years reading reports that summarized results without ever explaining the mechanisms that produced them, and now those mechanisms were failing all around her while she stood helplessly watching. On the drive back to headquarters that evening, staring out at the rain streaking down the car window, she finally allowed herself to consider a possibility she had dismissed too easily weeks earlier. Perhaps the company had never truly understood the value of the man they had let walk away so quietly. That night, unable to sleep, Victoria returned to her office and began digging through years of archived emails, project files, and old meeting minutes, searching for a pattern she was afraid she already knew she would find. She traced crisis after crisis back through the records: a supplier default 2 years earlier, a factory fire in Texas, a cybersecurity scare that had nearly compromised client data, and in every single case, the resolution led back to the same quiet name buried in the footnotes of official reports. Ethan Carter's name rarely appeared in the summaries presented to the board. Credit, instead absorbed by department heads, who had simply forwarded his solutions under their own signatures. It was not that anyone had maliciously erased him from the record. It was simply that no one had ever thought to ask who was actually doing the work. She found a particular email chain from nearly 3 years earlier that stopped her cold, a thread in which a department head named Harold Pierce had presented Ethan's entire disaster recovery plan for the Texas facility fire as his own strategic initiative during a board presentation. The original file, still buried deep in the shared server, carried Ethan's name in the document properties, time-stamped weeks before Harold had ever mentioned the plan publicly. Harold had gone on to receive a significant bonus that year, along with a promotion that placed him 2 levels above where Ethan had remained the entire time, quietly building the next solution for the next unseen crisis. Victoria closed her laptop that night feeling physically ill, understanding now that the culture she had presided over had rewarded visibility far more consistently than it had ever rewarded competence. As she dug deeper, a more troubling pattern began to surface, one that made her stomach tighten with a different kind of discomfort. She found several projects where Ryan, even before officially taking over the division, had subtly positioned himself as a contributor to initiatives that Ethan had designed and executed almost entirely alone. Emails showed Ryan requesting to be copied on project updates, then later referencing those same projects in casual conversations with the chairman, as evidence of his own operational instincts. It was a small deception, easy to overlook in isolation, but stacked together across dozens of instances, it painted the picture of a young man who had built a reputation not on his own competence, but on quietly borrowed credit. Victoria sat back in her chair long after midnight, the office empty and silent around her, and felt the sharp, uncomfortable sting of guilt settle into her chest. She thought about how many times she had praised Ryan in early meetings for insights that, she now realized, had likely never truly originated with him at all, but had simply passed through his hands on their way from Ethan's quiet office to the chairman's approving nod. It was a sobering thing to recognize how easily a confident voice in a well-tailored suit could be mistaken for genuine expertise, especially by people too busy to look closely enough to tell the difference. She wondered how many other companies, in how many other industries, were quietly propped up by people just like Ethan, unseen and unthanked, while men like Ryan collected the applause meant for someone else entirely. The thought unsettled her more than any falling stock price ever could. She thought about the meeting 3 weeks earlier, the 10 minutes it had taken to dismantle a career, and how easily she had gone along with a decision that, in hindsight, she had never truly examined. She had trusted the chairman's confidence in his son more than she had trusted her own instincts about the man who had quietly kept her company afloat for years. It was a humbling realization for someone who prided herself on data-driven decisions, discovering that the most important variable in the entire equation had been sitting in plain sight the whole time, unnoticed, simply because he never asked to be seen. By the time dawn broke over the city, Victoria had made up her mind about what she needed to do next, even if she was not yet certain how it would be received. She found Ethan 2 days later at the small logistics startup where he now worked. A modest office space above a coffee shop in a quieter part of the city, far removed from the glass towers of the corporate district. He was crouched beside a young warehouse manager, patiently explaining an inventory rotation system on a whiteboard. His tone as calm and unassuming as it had always been. When he looked up and saw Victoria standing in the doorway, rain still clinging to her coat, there was no flash of resentment in his eyes. No flicker of quiet satisfaction at seeing her arrive in obvious distress. He simply excused himself from the conversation, gestured toward a small meeting room, and waited for her to speak first. The small meeting room smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner, a stark contrast to the polished conference rooms Victoria was accustomed to, and she found the modesty of it oddly grounding after weeks of chaos in her own gleaming headquarters. Ethan offered her a seat across a scratched wooden table, poured her a cup of coffee from a machine that looked older than some of the interns at her own company, and waited patiently while she gathered her thoughts. She noticed, almost absently, a framed photograph on a nearby shelf of a young boy grinning on a soccer field. And something about the quiet pride in Ethan's eyes when he glanced at it made her hesitate before speaking. Victoria did not waste time with pleasantries. She told him everything. The collapsing production lines, the canceled contracts, the plummeting stock price, and the uncomfortable truths she had uncovered buried in years of old records. She admitted, with a rawness that surprised even her, that she had made a serious misjudgment in letting him go so easily, and that she owed him a genuine apology rather than a business proposal. Ethan listened without interrupting, his expression steady. And when she finally finished, he simply said that he was not angry with her, or with anyone else involved in the decision. He explained, gently but clearly, that a company does not collapse because it loses a single employee, no matter how skilled that employee might be. It collapses when it dismantles an entire system without understanding what that system was actually protecting it from. He spoke for a long while about the years he had spent quietly building processes that anticipated failure before it happened. Redundancies designed to catch problems long before they reached the surface. Relationships with suppliers cultivated specifically to buy flexibility during emergencies. None of it had been visible because that had been the entire point. A well-built system succeeds by making crisis invisible, not by drawing attention to the person managing it. Victoria realized, listening to him, that Ryan had never understood this distinction at all, mistaking the absence of visible problems for the absence of complexity, and dismantling careful architecture because he assumed it was simply unnecessary caution. It was, she thought bitterly, the arrogance of someone who had only ever studied success from the outside, never having built anything from nothing himself. Ethan continued, telling her about the years he had spent studying the company's failures long before he had ever been hired to fix them. Reading through old incident reports the way other people read novels, searching for the small warning signs that always preceded a larger disaster. He explained that true operational strength was rarely dramatic. It looked, from the outside, almost exactly like nothing happening at all, which was precisely why it was so easy for people who had never built such a system to assume it was unnecessary. Victoria found herself nodding along, recognizing in his words a kind of wisdom that no executive training program had ever taught her, a hard-won understanding that came only from years of quiet, thankless vigilance. By the time she left the small office that evening, the rain had softened into a light mist, and she walked several blocks before calling a car, needing the time to sit with everything she had just learned. Victoria returned to headquarters the following morning with a heavier understanding of the crisis than she had carried in weeks. But her first attempt to fix it did not go as smoothly as she had hoped. She approached Ethan again privately, this time with a direct offer to return to his old position, salary and title fully restored, but he declined without hesitation. He explained that he had no interest in becoming the company's emergency fire extinguisher, brought back only in moments of desperation and quietly forgotten again once stability returned. He had spent years being invaluable and invisible at the same time, and he was no longer willing to accept a role that offered responsibility without recognition or lasting structural respect. Victoria left that conversation disappointed, but not entirely surprised. Understanding on some level that a hasty offer, extended only after disaster had already struck, would never be enough to undo years of quiet neglect. She realized that winning back his trust would require more than a generous salary or a corner office. It would require proof, sustained over time, that the company was capable of genuine change rather than convenient, temporary correction. In the meantime, she had no choice but to continue managing the crisis with the resources still available to her. Even as those resources grew increasingly unreliable, under the weight of continued mismanagement, she began quietly documenting every decision Ryan made from that point forward, telling herself it was simply due diligence, though some part of her already suspected she was building a record she would eventually need. Ryan, meanwhile, continued making decisions that deepened the crisis rather than resolving it. Authorizing a rushed software migration that crashed the company's client database for nearly 2 full days. Customer service lines flooded with complaints, shipment tracking systems went dark, and several remaining clients quietly began exploring contracts with competitors instead of waiting for another apology email. Chairman Richard Ashford, once so certain of his son's readiness, began fielding uncomfortable phone calls from longtime business partners, questioning the direction of the company he had spent decades building. His patience, which had never been particularly deep to begin with, started visibly fraying under the mounting pressure. The board of directors, growing increasingly alarmed by the sustained financial losses, formally requested a detailed explanation from both the chairman and the chief executive officer regarding the operational collapse. Victoria found herself caught in an uncomfortable position, forced to defend decisions she no longer believed in while trying to determine how much responsibility ultimately belonged to her own hesitation weeks earlier. The pressure from shareholders intensified with each passing day. Journalists sharpened their questions about executive competence. And for the first time in her career, Victoria understood exactly how quickly trust, once broken, could spiral entirely beyond a single person's control. A senior board member named Gerald Whitfield, a stern man in his 70s who had sat on the board since the company's early years, requested a private meeting with Victoria and made his position painfully clear. He told her that the board had trusted her judgment when she approved the leadership change, and that trust was now costing shareholders real money, real jobs, and real damage to a reputation built over decades. Victoria absorbed his words without flinching, recognizing the fairness in his frustration, even as it stung, and promised him a full accounting of the situation within the week. She spent the following days preparing not excuses, but evidence, determined to bring the board a solution rather than another apology they had already grown tired of hearing. Determined to address the crisis honestly rather than quietly, Victoria organized a formal board meeting and prepared a presentation unlike any she had given before, one built not around projections or forecasts, but around uncomfortable historical truth. She displayed timelines, showing every major operational crisis the company had faced over the past several years, cross-referenced against internal records, showing exactly who had resolved each one. Name after name appeared on the screen, and again, buried beneath layers of departmental credit, the same quiet contributor emerged as the actual architect of every solution. The room fell silent as the pattern became impossible to ignore. Board members exchanging uneasy glances as the full scope of the misunderstanding settled over them. Gerald Whitfield leaned forward as the presentation continued, studying the timeline with the sharp focus of a man who had spent a lifetime reading financial statements for the small inconsistencies others missed. He asked Victoria directly whether the company had any formal record acknowledging Ethan's contributions, and when she admitted that almost none existed, he shook his head slowly, muttering that a company so careless with recognition deserved exactly the crisis it now found itself facing. Other board members began asking pointed questions of their own, wanting to know how such a significant blind spot had persisted for so long without anyone in senior leadership noticing or correcting it. Victoria answered each question honestly, refusing to shift blame onto anyone else, understanding that accountability, however uncomfortable, was the only path back to genuine credibility. Ryan was asked directly to explain several of the technical decisions he had made since taking over the division, and for the first time, his usual confidence failed him completely. He stumbled through vague, generalized answers that revealed a startling lack of understanding about the systems he had so casually dismantled weeks earlier. When pressed on the specifics of the failed database migration, he could not adequately explain why redundant safeguards had been removed or why client notification protocols had been ignored during the transition. Chairman Ashford, sitting near the head of the table, watched his son struggle through the questioning with an expression that slowly shifted from discomfort to quiet, painful acknowledgement. For the first time, Richard Ashford was forced to confront the truth that his son, however intelligent and well-educated, simply did not yet possess the practical experience necessary to lead a division of this scale and complexity. It was not a failure of character, but a failure of preparation, the gap between theoretical knowledge and lived operational wisdom that no business school lecture could ever fully bridge. After a tense, private conversation following the meeting, the chairman agreed that Ryan would step down from his position, a decision that visibly wounded the young man's pride, but ultimately spared him from further public embarrassment. Ryan left the meeting that day changed in a way he had not expected, the first genuine humility he had shown in months. He sat alone afterward in his father's car for nearly an hour, staring silently out the window at the rain-streaked city, replaying the questions he had failed to answer, and finally beginning to understand how much he had never actually known about the division he had so confidently taken over. For the first time since returning from business school, the certainty that had carried him through every classroom debate and every confident conversation with his father felt hollow and unearned. He thought about Diane Foster and Tyler Grant, about the managers he had dismissed without truly understanding what they protected, and a quiet, uncomfortable shame settled over him that no lecture hall had ever prepared him to feel. It was, in its own painful way, the first real lesson of his professional life. A few days after Ryan's removal, Victoria requested one final meeting with Ethan, though this time she arrived without a formal offer letter or a predetermined title in mind. She told him plainly that the company needed someone to rebuild not just its broken systems, but its entire culture, one that had clearly stopped recognizing real contribution long before he had ever been pushed out the door. She made no promises about compensation or position, only that the mistakes of the past would not be quietly repeated if he chose to return. She brought with her a folder containing every document she had uncovered during her investigation, laying it on the table between them as proof that she was no longer approaching him with vague apologies but with clear, specific understanding of exactly what the company had failed to see. She told him about Gerald Whitfield's blunt words in the boardroom, about Harold Pierce's borrowed credit, about the quiet culture of visibility over substance that had shaped the company for years before either of them had fully recognized it. Ethan listened closely, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw something shift behind his careful composure. Not triumph, but a cautious, guarded hope that perhaps something had genuinely changed. He asked her a single question before responding to her offer, wanting to know whether she was prepared to defend those changes even when they became inconvenient for people more powerful than either of them. Ethan listened carefully, weighing her words with the same careful patience he brought to every decision. And after a long silence, he agreed to come back under 3 specific conditions he had clearly thought through in advance. The first condition was that leadership positions would never again be handed out based on family relationships or personal favoritism, regardless of how much pressure came from above. The second was that credit for every project, every solution, and every success would be documented transparently so that no one's contribution could ever again be quietly absorbed by someone standing closer to the spotlight. The third and final condition was that Victoria herself would personally evaluate leadership candidates through direct observation of their actual decision-making, Rather than relying solely on polished reports and second-hand summaries, Victoria agreed to all three without hesitation, recognizing in his careful, deliberate terms not bitterness, but the wisdom of a man who had learned exactly how easily good work could be erased if no one protected it. She promised him, looking him directly in the eye rather than glancing at the folder between them, that she would personally answer to the board for every one of those conditions, even if it meant standing against pressure from the chairman himself. Ethan studied her for a long moment, searching her expression for the kind of hesitation he had seen in the meeting 3 weeks earlier, and found none. He extended his hand across the scratched wooden table, and Victoria shook it firmly, sealing an agreement built not on contracts or legal language, but on something far more fragile and far more valuable. Mutual trust rebuilt from the wreckage of a mistake they both now understood clearly. Outside the small office window, the city had finally stopped raining, sunlight breaking weakly through the clouds for the first time, in what felt like weeks. Ethan returned to the company not as a man seeking vindication, but as someone determined to build something sturdier than what had existed before, something that could not be so easily dismantled by a single careless decision. He spent his first weeks back walking the factory floors personally, listening to employees at every level, restoring the redundant safeguards that had been so hastily removed, and rebuilding trust with clients through direct, honest communication rather than empty reassurances. He did not seek revenge against anyone who had wronged him, choosing instead to focus entirely on repairing what had been broken and strengthening what had merely bent under pressure. Slowly, delivery stabilized, production resumed its normal rhythm, and the anxious phone calls from worried clients gradually gave way to renewed confidence. He brought Diane Foster back to the company as well, offering her not just her old position but an expanded role overseeing supplier relationships across every division, a decision that quietly repaired one of the deepest wounds left by Ryan's hasty restructuring. Tyler Grant, to his credit, chose to stay on and learn under her guidance rather than leaving in embarrassment. And within a few months, he had become one of the more thoughtful members of the rebuilt operations team. Ethan made a point of formally documenting every contribution across every department, creating a transparent internal record that made it impossible for credit to quietly disappear the way it once had. James Odom, the floor supervisor who had finally spoken honestly to Victoria during the darkest days of the crisis, was promoted to a senior operations role, his years of quiet insight finally given the recognition they had always deserved. Within 6 months, the company had not only recovered from the crisis but had grown stronger than it had been before the collapse, its stock price climbing well past the levels it had reached prior to Ryan's brief and turbulent leadership. The corporate culture shifted in ways that were impossible to ignore. Contribution now tracked openly. Promotions tied directly to demonstrated competence rather than connection, and a renewed sense of respect settling over departments that had once operated in quiet, thankless anonymity. Ryan, humbled by the entire experience, chose to leave the company voluntarily, accepting a much lower position at a smaller firm where he would finally learn, from the ground up, what real operational leadership actually required. It was, in its own quiet way, the beginning of a more honest chapter in his life as well. Before he left, he sought out Ethan one final time, finding him in the same modest office 2 floors below the executive suite that he had once dismissed as unimportant. He offered, haltingly, an apology that clearly did not come easily to him, admitting that he had mistaken confidence for competence and had never truly understood the weight of what he had so carelessly dismantled. Ethan accepted the apology without bitterness, telling him only that real leadership was learned the same way real trust was earned, slowly, through mistakes honestly reckoned with rather than avoided. Chairman Richard Ashford, watching his son walk a harder, humbler road than the one he had once smoothed for him, found himself surprised to feel not disappointment, but a cautious, quiet pride in the man his son might still become. One evening, long after most of the staff had gone home, Victoria found herself standing on the rooftop terrace of the headquarters building, the city spread out beneath her in a sea of golden lights, beginning to flicker on against the darkening sky. Ethan joined her there, saying little at first, simply standing beside her in the comfortable silence that had grown between them over the difficult months they had shared. Victoria finally spoke, admitting quietly that what she admired most about him was never simply his brilliance with numbers and systems, but the steadiness with which he had carried himself even when he had every right to be furious. She told him that his composure in the face of such obvious injustice had taught her more about leadership than any business degree ever could. Ethan smiled faintly, watching the lights of the city stretch out toward the horizon, and told her that no company's success should ever be built entirely on the shoulders of one person, no matter how capable that person might be. Real strength, he said, came from a system wise enough to notice and protect its most valuable people before circumstance forced it to learn the hard way. Victoria nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what he meant, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything more, content simply to stand together in the quiet after the storm. The city lights continued to rise around them, warm and steady against the darkening sky. And in that shared silence, something new and unhurried had quietly begun to take root. A partnership built not on urgency, but on the slow, patient trust of two people who had finally learned to see each other clearly. Below them, the factories were running again, humming with the steady rhythm of a machine finally restored to full health, and the quarterly reports that would soon land on desks throughout the building would carry numbers no one had dared to hope for only months earlier. Somewhere overseas, a young boy would soon hear his father's voice on the phone, lighter than it had sounded in years, telling him about a company that had learned, the hard way, what it truly meant to value the people who kept it standing. Victoria would go on to change the way the entire organization measured leadership, insisting that every promotion be earned through demonstrated skill rather than proximity to power, a policy that would quietly reshape the culture for years to come. And Ethan, the man once dismissed in a meeting that lasted only 10 minutes, would remain exactly what he had always been: steady, unshaken, and quietly indispensable. Only now, finally, seen.